Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar. It's titled Building Blocks for Next Generation Security Operations. It's sponsored by Optiv and broadcast by Informa. My name is Becky Bracken. I'm with Dark Reading and I will be your moderator for today. But before we get started, we have just a few announcements. First of all, this webinar is designed to be interactive. There's a dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen, which will allow you to learn more about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and importantly, participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you may also download a copy of these slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of the webinar, we're going to ask you to provide feedback via the survey widget, which is found at the bottom of your screen. If you could please take a minute to fill it out before leaving us today, we'd appreciate it, as your feedback provides us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, you can click the help widget, which is found at the bottom of your screen, or if it's easier, just type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer you one-on-one assistance. With that, let's get on to the presentation, Building Blocks for Next Generation Security Operations. Today, we have discussing the topic, Jake Williams, who's VP of R&D at Hunter Strategy, and John Pelton, who's Senior Director of Cyber Operations at Optiv. If you want to learn more about our speakers, you can find their bios in the speaker bio widget at the bottom of your screen. And again, if you want to ask them any questions at any time throughout the presentation, just drop those into the Q&A area and we will get to those. So with that, I am happy to hand things over to Jake Williams. Jake?
Hey, thanks so much, Becky. Really appreciate it. So as Becky mentioned, I'm going to be joined today by John Pelton. John's got fantastic experience here in security operations, as well, obviously, as I do. Some of our pre-show, conversations, we're kind of scoping this out. We are really of one mind, having been there, done that, and had proverbial, own the proverbial T-shirt on, seeing the changes in security operations centers over the years. And so, if you have questions, John is a wealth of knowledge. I hope to be as well. So if you have questions, as Becky mentioned, please do drop those in the Q&A widget. So that we can get those answered for you live here. Otherwise, we're going to try to keep this pretty conversational, kicking back and forth between me and John as we get a bit of discussion in here about next-gen security operations. So here's my agenda for today. I'm not going to read all the bullets here because we're going to talk about this stuff anyway. So, but a little bit of an idea of what I plan to cover and what me and John will talk a bit about here. But I want to start with, first SOC modernization. And I want to note here that the SOC of today, 2024, bears little resemblance to the security ops centers of the previous decade. I'm going to tell you that this is something that I see as a real challenge for a lot of folks who have found their way back to SOC management, right? So they started, as many of us did, doing security operations center work as analysts. They then move out of that and then are coming back in to go manage a SOC. And they're finding out that the SOC today just doesn't work the way the SOC did when they came up, 10 years ago. And they've been absent from it for a while. And I think all of this makes sense intuitively, right? But I do want to call out here that the breadth of data that you're collecting has grown exponentially, just exponentially. The scope of your duties is larger. It is a rare day that I'm not, handling a call with one of my clients, where they're not asking like, hey, should the SOC be handling X, whatever X happens to be. I know some security operations centers today that are tasked with the maintenance of their physical access control systems, right? Like your badge swipe readers, right? And or badge readers. It's like, wow, that just was not something I dealt with in SOC of the past. But then we get into just this huge technology sprawl, and we'll come back around to that in a little bit here. The net impact of this, though, is that your average entry-level SOC analyst has a ridiculously larger skill demand than they did even just a few years ago. Um, this is great if you work in incident response, because the challenges of the SOC today very much influence how you are likely to end up in, working more incidents. If you're an organization trying to secure a network, this is just bad, right? Look, just as security professionals, let's just go ahead and call this suboptimal or just outright bad. So, I want to mention here, by the way, the piece of AI art here, right? I'm generally not a big AI art aficionado, but I do like this one, where I feel like this is what it's like to be a SOC analyst in some security ops centers now. I will tell you that when I work incidents, and I'll come back around to this, as we kind of wrap up the presentation, but I want to seed you, with this idea that in the vast majority of incidents that I'm called into work, we find an improperly actioned alarm in the SOC. Right? It's not just they had the data, it's the data generated an alarm, and it was improperly dispositioned. I don't blame my SOC analysts for this. I want to be clear, because when you're doing this kind of maneuver here, right, where it looks like Neo in the Matrix dodging bullets, trying to manage all of and contorting yourself, trying to manage all these different things that you have being thrown at you, I do expect stuff to be improperly dispositioned. I am today working with SOC analysts who, are answering alarms on Kubernetes clusters and barely can spell Kubernetes. You ask them, what's Kubernetes? Right? That's the container stuff, right? Okay, look, I'm just going to tell you now, that's not a knock on a SOC analyst, but the reality is that when we put analysts in that kind of position, we have to expect then that we are going to have, some failures here. As I was prepping this deck, my good friend Anton Chavakin, Dr. Chavakin, tweeted this, and I can hardly think of a better quote here. It's all about process. It's just all about process. I mean, don't get me wrong. You have to have tools. You're going to have a SIEM still in most cases. You're going to have EDR and XDR. Those are table stakes, right? If you're going to have a SOC, right, you're going to have these. But the reality is, with outdated practices, you still are going to have an outdated SOC. And that's what I'm seeing with so much of my client base, is they're saying, oh, we bought a bunch of tools, so now we're good, right? And John, I want to bring you into the conversation here. What's your take on this with tooling versus process? How important is process today as we start talking about next generation security ops center?
It's absolutely critical. I mean, when you think about the number of tools that we have at our disposal now, like great capabilities there, but if we don't actually have the processes defined on how to best integrate everything and harmonize it, it's all for nothing. You're going to start doing things out of order. You're going to have no measurement. And really, when we think about the level of scale and the number of attacks that we need to thwart every single day, if we don't have the appropriate measurement within all of those processes on, this is how long this is taking me to do something, this is how long it's actually taking me to get that next step and execute it, then we can't even consider the orchestration automation thing that needs to be down the line, because then you're going to start automating things that sound good, but maybe they don't actually have a material impact for the rest of your team. And you're going to continue to work through all of those high stress alarms and make those incorrect decisions, as you mentioned previously. So everything needs to start with governance and strategy and building process as that first building block, and measurement needs to be very tightly coupled to that. Otherwise, it's going to spiral out of control, and you're going to be quickly just going fire to fire. It's going to be a whirlwind instead of something that's organized and managed and something that you actually have confidence in that will work as expected day to day.
Yeah, you brought up that measurement point, and man, that is so critical, right? Because so many folks today, don't have good SOC metrics, or to the extent that they do, they're what I call vanity metrics, right? It's the how many alarms did we get? How many phishing alarms or phishing emails did we block? I'm like, I couldn't care less, right? Like those are not useful metrics to me. How long it took me to disposition a critical incident and actually remediate that matters, right? From time of alarm, that kind of stuff. Do you want to speak a little bit to the stuff you measure when you go in to start helping one of these SOCs mature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the key ones, mean time to acknowledge, right? How long is it actually taking you to get something before even doing that investigation through? That's absolutely critical. But we're also looking now a lot more micro measurements, such as how many second searches are we doing that can be pulled from like a templated library? And then we can measure and quantify at this rate, we're burning 4 hours a day just doing this one action, right? And this is the most expensive thing that we're doing from a people perspective. Let's actually evaluate this from an automation perspective and see if we can buy that time back for our people to then use the thing between their ears and critical thinking. Threat lookups by type. How effective is threat intelligence being leveraged? A number of really small things that, while they make up those larger measurements, such as mean time to acknowledge, mean time to respond, remediate, that really helps us make educated decisions as we're pushing changes in our process to be more effective, right? We really want to be able to break it down to understand that how are we doing? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? But then what are all of those sub measurements that tell us if we focus on this, this will really materially impact the way that this larger KPI is trending.
I love that. I love that term you used, right? With the, can I buy that time back? I always tell folks when I'm consulting and talking particularly about modernization stuff, and automation, I tell them I like to bifurcate what we're talking about from stuff that I can buy my way out of without buying more people, right? And stuff that I can't, right? And to your point, if I'm not measuring this stuff, it's hard to quantify, right? And say, okay, well, for this particular lookup or this whatever that happens to be, how can I buy that? Basically, again, like what's the cost to automate? And then I can show a very clear cost justification there, so that again, I'm freeing up my analysts for the stuff that requires the gray matter between their ears, right? Fantastic. I'm loving that. Any other thoughts on that before we move on?
No, I would say just maybe the last closing thought is when you are able to quantify it to that level, going to the business and saying, this is the investment I need for next year. And you can kind of show that baseline of this is what we did. You gave me this investment. I was able to take it from here to here. It's more cost effective now. It resonates much more with the people who are actually pulling those purse strings when you can actually show them what you're buying back that time and bringing everything to some form of quantification. So very useful also, not only from the security perspective and making getting your posture to a better state, but also continuing to ask for money for next year to strengthen the defenses there.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, right? Because we all struggle with that security return on investment, right? And you're saying effectively, we're already spending money here. We know we've already justified that security ops have to occur. Now let me show you how we can do effectively more, right? With the resources that the people resources that we have, because that is the most expensive component of any security ops program, right? So I want to pivot over here into process. Look, I tell folks regularly, I can run a SOC with very, very minimal tooling, right? If you force me to go out and go all open source, I'm not saying I want to, but we can do it, right? There's obviously a reason commercial products exist, but I'm going to tell you, I will take a SOC with less tooling and more process over one with more tooling and less process every day of the week. I mentioned earlier in high-profile incidents, we routinely, it's almost universal, identify process failures in the SOC as a contributing factor, right? It's improperly dispositioned alarms. And again, this isn't the fault of the SOC, right? It's, well, maybe SOC leadership, line analysts, almost never their problem. It's something that we've asked analysts to, like, you get to spend 5 minutes on this before you've got to move on, and it's something that takes longer. Well, again, if we can put the information in front of them that they need to be able to disposition properly, maybe 5 minutes is enough, right? Or 10 minutes or whatever the time frame happens to be. But this really comes down to you have to develop process. And, pivoting out of that, I do want to note here, building process is one of those things that is really easy to say. It is really hard to do, right? And this is a spot I want to get John back in here, on. John, what do you think is the biggest impediment for most organizations and their security ops centers building those processes that we all agree are critical? What's the biggest impediment there?
I think adoption from all of the individual contributors continues to be something that's challenging. We as humans, we like being able to be a little bit more free-minded and empowered and do what we think is right. But sometimes we don't have the right context to understand the larger impact. And that if I do this where I think this is the right thing to do, I don't have that bigger picture that I actually might be going against the grain and creating more risk for the organization. So one thing that we've done really to help expand the process creation and get better enablement is getting more of the individual contributors involved creating those processes. So we have somebody who is an expert on it. They'll record it. They'll do a couple of shoulder surfing sessions with somebody. They'll do it 3 times so that we can kind of see any type of gotchas that might pop up if they do it once. And then we hand it off to somebody else to then actually create and document that process and do it. And then that person becomes the owner then. When they're able to do a little bit of that fine tuning and detail, they're just more involved in it. And then we see them go out and train the rest of the team. And we just get greater adoption because everybody feels empowered. They're working on it together instead of maybe just a couple of smart people that feel like they're in the room dictating something down and then everybody needs to follow it. So process is absolutely critical. And I think really getting everybody's buy-in and making sure that they're all felt heard and their ideas can come in and they can actively contribute is really key from an adoption perspective. People feel part of it there. They're more passionate about it than just all of these documents and processes being trickled down to the team and just they follow all of this, right? That's when you get people starting to go against the grain there and not following everything to a T.
Love that. It's for me, you know, I would say my number one impediment is time, right? Because so many SOCs are already underwater, and when they don't have the staffing resources to keep up with what they feel like even are the critical operations, right? Saying, okay, now take this time to document it's just not time they have, right? And we've seen this in IT, right? I often call back to like idle transformations, right? ITIL, you know, is a fantastic, ITSM strategy. But make no mistake about it, it takes time to develop the service catalogs and the process around that. And if your IT is already underwater, you can't make that transformation. I see the same thing here. But to your point around adoption, I mean, it's huge to make sure that people feel empowered. And that's something we see a lot is that when, one of the things I always tell folks, and I don't know if I'm interested in your thoughts on this, is that this process, right, if it's wrong, I need you to tell me it's wrong. I want you to feel empowered, right, to break glass and deviate from the process. But you don't just do that willy-nilly. It gets documented why you deviated from the process, and that probably needs to be a new flowchart entry or a new, piece in that, in that process, right, that we didn't consider originally, right? So, thoughts on that? Where do you land there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why we typically, when we're building a process, we have somebody go through it multiple times to kind of try to uncover some of those right then and there. And typically what we do at that point is when we get to a point, we can actually break it down to a root cause of why have you deviated from that. We then will have the analyst kind of swivel seat to an expert in that area, right? So if it's something where like it's perimeter or identity, we don't want that analyst to then need to go try to research all of that end to end to figure out what are the in-depth configurations that would actually make this easier. Go leverage a resource that already has that knowledge, tap into that knowledge as one of your key resources so that they can then show you the way and then you can adapt the process there. So a lot of it does come down to finding all of those deviations, asking why 5 times, really getting to that root cause, and then going to lean on other experts to help bring more knowledge to that. As you've alluded to it a little bit in the previous slides, but there are more and more tools and just pillars and types of information that we need to look at. There's no one person that sits in a SOC that knows the ins and outs of absolutely everything. So effectively use the resources around you to optimize those processes, get yourself back on track.
Yep. And I want to call out something here that in the golden nugget that John just dropped, in case you missed it in passing, and where he talked about the 5 whys method. Right, he said asking why 5 times. That's a documented management method for getting to root cause. I'm not going to belabor it here, right? But if you want to speak the same language as your business executives, you want to show that you're using the same kind of analytic rigor that they bring to many of their processes, tell them you've adopted the 5 whys method. Of course, actually do it because it is really, really effective. One of the things we see when we start talking automation is folks will come back and say, well, don't worry, automation is going to save the SOC. I've been on this train for a long time. I'm going to tell you the vast majority of organizations that try to deploy SOAR, security orchestration, automation, and response, do not see the value that they expected come out of that at the 12, 24, and 36 month deployment points. So I will tell you that the big root cause for this, because I've been involved in dozens of organizations now over the last decade, it is lack of process. It's they have processes, but they're not flow-charted processes. They're not algorithmic processes. And that's what you need, right? Because at the end of the day, right, if I'm going to fully automate something, that process, or at least the portion of the process I'm going to automate, I'll come to the portion piece in just a second, it has to be laid out in an algorithmic fashion. I can't say then have the analysts think about it for a minute, because there's no SOAR module that says cool, the SOAR will do like the analyst and make a judgment call, right? The reality here then is that automation, while a lot of folks think and say, well, a small security ops center, they'll benefit from a bunch of automation. Well, they can, right? But those small security ops centers are also the ones least likely to already have process in place. And that becomes kind of one of the dirty little secrets that I've seen in automation, SOC automation, over the last decade and change here. I want to give at least my kind of free consulting on how do you use automation correctly. And for me, this is, I only automate processes that are already mature. I don't go in and when we do SOAR deployments, I don't come in and say, now let's create a process that we can then deploy in the SOAR. I create the process, we battle test it, right? To John's point, we get those subject matter experts red teaming the process, looking for those gotcha moments, right? Looking for the places we need to bail out of the process. If a SOC analyst has to deviate from the established process, it's not ready for automation, right? Or at a minimum, I need to be able to capture those deviation points and stop the automation, right? And then hand it off to an analyst. I will share with you that response actions are almost invariably easier to automate than the decision to invoke it, right? And this is where a lot of folks are like, I'm going to fully automate a phishing ticket. And I'm like, I don't want to do that, right? I mean, maybe down the road, we'll try that. But today, I want to first put a bunch of information in front of your analysts, those threat lookups that John was talking about that take inordinate amounts of time for our analysts. I don't want them to have to start looking and clicking and completing this process that literally, like, I could train anybody who knows how to use a computer to do, right? Present the information to them, right? Now the SOC analyst, now we're into stuff not everybody can do, interpret that information. And then when they want to go and execute a response action, whether that's delete the email from everybody's mailbox, block that email address at the secure email gateway, what have you, they press a button to do it, right? And that then is a semi-automated process, right? That we're still freeing up, especially if we have good measurement, right? Dozens to hundreds of hours a month in SOC analyst time. And John, I want to pivot back over to you here on your thoughts around building out automations. Does this align with what you do, or if not, any other words of wisdom for our audience?
No, absolutely. I mean, the way that I describe it to our team is especially when we're creating a new orchestration automation, is our goal is to automate the majority of that picture being painted for you from an analyst perspective, not creating the entire thing and then selling it online, right? We want to make sure that all of that information gathering, the presentation, the normalization of it, the enrichment of observables and threat intelligence, historical lookbacks. If the first thing the analyst looks at is a nice, pretty summary of all of this information, they can then use critical thinking to say, and now I need to go do this, and I'm going to click this button to isolate an endpoint or lock a user's account out or do something like that. So we really do focus on gathering all of the information in a much more consumable way than typically what a single alert with some of the metadata would be able to provide. That is the goal. And then we look at those on what are the ones when we can measure that, okay, these take almost no time to actually analyze because all of the data gathering and presentation is done. Now, what are the ones that we have the highest true positive rates? And then we can break that down even further to see, is there some form of action that we want to actually automate at that point? Or is the time it takes to do that still within kind of acceptable thresholds and bounds there, referencing some of those other KPIs. So absolutely agree. A lot of people start with, we're going to automate this process end to end. And as soon as this activity happens, we're going to be secure. That is the wrong way to do it. You're going to take machines off the network that shouldn't be taken off the network. You're going to interrupt revenue generating streams. You're going to close out true positives with bad information. But if you start by gathering all of that information and painting that picture for the analyst through automation, you're going to have a much more measured outcome and be much more successful with fewer mistakes along the way.
That's fantastic. And hey, while we're still in the automation piece, we've got a question here in the chat. It says, do many SOCs run into the situation where they don't have permission to disconnect a user, block emails, et cetera, but have to go through IT? And my answer to this, and John, I want your experience here too, is yes. I see that with a lot of security operations centers. When I ask the 5 whys around this, right, and get to root cause, in most cases, what I've experienced is when we have to go through IT, it's because giving the SOC the appropriate permission level to be able to lock that user account or what have you, right, is the kind of thing that grants them lots of other permissions. And my fix for this is automation. It's an automation playbook where I can hook up and say, they can press this button, right, which ultimately is calling into the service account. But my junior SOC analyst who just got hired last week does not then have permissions to do all the other stuff maybe that account might be granted access to. John, your thoughts on this?
100% agree with that. I think it ultimately all comes down to process. People are probably getting sick of hearing about that. But when you can come to IT and say, these are all of the things that will happen in a very measured approach, and these are the decisions before we will even consider clicking that button, and this is the positive impact for you, you can then start building more trust between security and IT, right? A lot of times they are just very overly protective. They don't want to give those reins out because that might cause some additional work on their end. But when you can say that, but we're going to be doing all of these steps and it is going to be measured and it's going to be repeatable, we're going to be using automation where possible, then we're going to take this action. They understand it more, right? It's not, to your point, the junior analyst making a bad decision on a very low level alert. It is well thought out. It is vetted. We've red teamed the process. We've really thought about this. That helps build trust between the two different teams there.
Yeah. Well, and then critically too, right? It's not that junior SOC analyst, using some break glass account, right, to go RDP in someplace and go click a button or whatever. It's the outcomes are more consistent, and that's another thing again that just I find that really alleviates a lot of those, the concerns, right? Is when I can say this is the only outcome that's going to occur here. Right. So, I want to talk briefly about technology sprawl because reality check here, right? John already mentioned this. I brought it up too. There are just more tools that you have to be aware of. And look, we didn't have the majority of these, right? Back in the day, right? Roll back 10 years ago, most of this stuff just wasn't a thing, or it certainly didn't have the adoption level that it does in the vast majority of security operations centers. So not only is the security technology sprawl a thing, but technology sprawl in general, from an infrastructure standpoint, is also a huge, huge concern. And one of my case studies I always bring up is CSPM and CNAP, because these are difficult technologies for most of my security, particularly my entry-level folks, right, to really wrap their heads around for a lot of reasons. And I'll mention here, before we move to the cloud, before we have widespread public cloud adoption, we didn't need these. These are net new technologies that we have today that we didn't used to. And so the other thing that I like to bring up about these is that a lot of the times they are, I hate to call them false positives, that they are detecting what they claim to detect, right? It's a question of, is it meaningful to you? And unfortunately, interpreting that means you have to understand cloud architecture. You have to understand what the tool is telling you and be able to interpret that in the context of not only generic cloud architecture, but then how are your applications deployed? This is a huge, huge issue, particularly for younger, I say younger, but for less experienced SOC analysts. And that really pivots us over into the jack of all trades SOC analyst is really beginning to be a thing of the past. Responding to security alarms requires an understanding of the underlying technology. I always use examples of containers, right? If you don't know what a container is beyond it's that thing they use to package up an app, cool, right? That's not context that you can effectively use to go and answer a security alarm. Same thing with Kubernetes, right? Another great example of a technology the vast majority of you here are using, but your security ops center probably doesn't have a real understanding of. Of course, this really drives up the cost of staffing that next-gen SOC that has to answer alarms being generated on these technologies. And obviously, the smaller the organization, the fewer people you have, the more the specialization really impacts you. And John, I'm seeing a big push towards, the need for specialization. I'm also talking to lots of security leaders who are like, I don't have the bench depth, right, to go and help specialize all of these different, needs that we have. How are you seeing folks handle this in the field?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and you absolutely do need a plan to address this. One of the things that we leverage is job rotation, right? So we'll create a center of excellence around a pillar, get those analysts closer aligned with the engineers to develop and document those processes. And then every 6 months, we'll move them into something similar, but maybe a little bit different from an information sharing perspective. So maybe you have some analysts that are really focused on IPS alerts, vulnerabilities. They're leveraging Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7. And then after 6 months, move them into supporting more of the CSPM style alerts, get that knowledge built up there, and then continue to leverage that job rotation so that they're not doing the same thing day in and day out. They're still getting those learning opportunities. And you're also spreading the knowledge across people in your SOC. However, if you don't have that luxury, right, if you have a very small team, that becomes very, very, very challenging to execute on. There's just not enough time in the day. There's not enough mental capacity to throw this many things at a human being while they're expected to work all of these alerts in that high stress situation. That's where I think it is key to evaluate the deck of cards or the hand of cards that you've been dealt. And does this make sense to bring a service provider in? Can you realistically be successful with this, or do you look to pay somebody to bring that expertise and knowledge to house to really act as an extension of your team and reduce the risk of humans just not being able to stay on top of all of this? We're just too wide at this point to have a couple of analysts know all of this end to end.
Yeah, no, look, that's huge. It's absolutely huge, right? But part of my job, I work with IANS research. We're decision support folks, and we've got 100 some odd analysts on, or SMEs, on faculty. We have that many because nobody knows it all, right? I routinely get call requests, right, where folks are like, hey, talk about this. And I'm like, I am not your guy, right? Like, I'm just not. And again, here I am, 2 decades plus into the field. You're a junior SOC analyst who's coming out of, a tech program or, an associate's degree or even bachelor's degree program. They are just not equipped to learn all these, all these different platforms. And even then, I'm regularly surprised by new stuff, right? That like I just haven't had to deal with, a particular problem before. And so it's becoming a real challenge. I do want to pivot to something though that you mentioned, John, about about having to really evaluate the deck, or the hand of cards you've been dealt, right? And saying, is it time to bring in a service provider? I'm going to talk a little bit more about the in-source versus outsource piece, but specifically as we talk about specialization, right? What's your guidance there for bringing in a service provider? Let's say you clearly can't do it all, right? Do you bring in the service provider to handle the lower level tickets and giving your people the time to free up to specialize? Or do you bring in the service provider to handle the specialization? What's your general approach there and guidance for folks in the audience today?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a blend there, right? A service provider should, like, what you don't want to do is have people that have high business context of your own individual organization working all of the low level alerts, right? Like that, they can be much more valuable understanding what's going on in your organization, hearing the water cooler talk of what's keeping other people up at night and those problems. You do want to free those people to be able to solve those problems and use that closer knowledge and context to drive better outcomes. But you also do want to be able to lean on those expert level resources, right? It is a luxury that we have teams of people on specific platforms that there's 15 engineers, and this is all they do, right? An individual organization very rarely gets 15 engineers with principal level resources that are invited to special meetings with the vendor to talk about roadmaps and get feedback in there. Like, there is just a wealth of knowledge that you can leverage there. So I think it's somewhere in the middle there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't go to a service provider to just handle the L1, L2 stuff. You also do want to be able to lean on all of that expertise there so that ultimately your team can focus on ideally the recommendations from a service provider and figuring out how to implement those in your business environment and gain adoption and not cause too much friction there.
Yeah, I love what you pointed out there, and I want to make sure that folks didn't miss this, right? John really highlighted something there about the business context, right? And there are tickets and alarms that require a lot of business context, and there are some that don't, right? Your average phishing alarm requires zero business context, right? To really get in and run to ground. On the flip side of things, right? Your average CNAP provider or CNAP alarm, so because now we're talking about cloud platforms, typically requires a little bit more business context, right? How is the application deployed on top of the platform? Is this really something we need to action? And how are we going to action it without breaking the business? Again, that's stuff that requires a lot more high touch, and so I'm with you there. I love to separate based on business context, not necessarily severity of the alarm. Likewise with phishing, right, or account takeover type stuff, account takeover risks. I think we all know that executives are a little bit different than everybody else, and they require high touch, and that's a great spot for internal folks to be involved, versus necessarily external. So I'm with you. I think it's mixed bag, kind of stuff there. So, but kind of pivoting over there, I do want to mention, lack of standardization is a big hindrance. And John, I heard you mention a couple of times normalizing data. We're talking about automation. No two tools, it seems, use the same format. Even with OCSF out there, they're trying to change that, but let's be real, adoption's pretty slow on that. What's your take here? How do you fix this problem?
You need to start with understanding what are you expecting to do today, what are your goals, but as well as what's down the road from 12 months, 3 years as well. When we first started really going down the SOAR journey, there was no serious return on investment from a SOAR perspective until at least 8 months in, because we had to spend time redeveloping and restandardizing everything, getting it into a much more consistent language. That problem is obviously exponentially worse at a managed service provider where you have a number of clients that all are doing everything a little bit differently. We see a number of different tools on different versioning, maybe parsing's different. There needs to be a lot of strategy put into that. Otherwise, orchestration automation is going to just turn into a lot of tech debt for you. So it is absolutely critical, I would say, behind actually the processes. You need to make sure that the data that you're looking at is normalized and in a way that it makes sense. You can automate off of it. You're going to develop the muscle memory of what to do. And you don't need to spend as much time researching and referencing logging standards from a firewall versus how maybe CloudTrail is reporting it, right? When you're just seeing very minor differences in kind of key value pairs. So adopting a form of normalization and getting that out everywhere and making sure that everybody is understanding of that model. It's key for scale. Otherwise, it's going to be death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better myself, man. That is that aligns very well with what I deal with. I said we were going to pivot back to the in-source versus outsource question here. Look, the reality is that the threat actors, operate around the clock. Right? I don't have to tell you this. Everybody intuitively knows this. And then somehow I continue to talk to businesses that your business leaders understand this. My security leaders understand this. And they're like, yep, we've got an 8x5 SOC. And I'm like, neat. That does not align to risk. It doesn't align to what we just agreed on, that threat actors operate around the clock. We've seen failure after failure after failure with the PagerDuty style model of, don't worry, it'll send an email and whoever's on call will definitely respond to that. Okay, right? So, lots of incidents that contributes there. And again, it's not always a person failure. It can be a critical path failure where the alarm doesn't, push through, SNS or whatever the, notification platform is. And but then we bump into the other specialization problem. Whoever's on call has a big, incentive not to call anyone else in, right? And they are the odds that they're the specialist on whatever it is that's coming across the wire at 1 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday. Odds are good they're not that person, right? So it creates bad responses. I'll just note here that outsourced security operations centers that are serving a lot of customers, John already mentioned this, that's where you've got 15 engineers, right, that are trained in this stuff. And again, John mentioned another critical thing, there. It's not just that they're experts, it's because of the scale. They are sitting in meetings that your engineers are not, right? They are getting a chance not only to hear about roadmap, but influence roadmap on tools. And so also they're amortizing the cost of lessons learned across lots of clients, right? Instead of having to reinvent the wheel every time. I will also mention here that this problem that we're talking about with technology sprawl it's not only not going away. I'm going to make an argument here that it's accelerating. As IT brings in new technologies, and there are a plethora of them, the SOC has to secure it immediately. But be real, your SOC staffing and training budgets are not keeping pace with those new technology deployments. That's a reality. I see it every day, in the field. And so I just want to note here, that's another benefit of outsourcing. Again, I'm not a big insource it all or outsource it all guy. I agree with what John said. You play the hand you're dealt. But I also want to make sure that you are, as I'm talking about this stuff, that you're critically evaluating the hand that you're being dealt, and not kind of having the head in the sand moment where don't worry, we'll train on that next year. It's like I have to secure it today. John, I want to pitch back to you here for some discussion on this. Any additional thoughts on this in-source versus outsource discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, maybe just to elaborate on the point that those engineers do get exposed to additional meetings, you also get exposed to a lot more unique situations that cause kind of just critical thinking and need to problem solve. I've been with Optiv for 10 years. I learn something new every single day. And if I don't, I would be I would get burnt out, right? I thrive based on learning new things. So being able to just be rapidly exposed to different situations and problems that different industries and verticals or tools or broken processes are bringing to light, I think it really motivates a certain type of people, given they can just continuing to expand their knowledge at a rate that not everybody gets that luxury to. So you can also lean on that kind of perspective from a service provider, in that they've probably experienced some problems that you wouldn't think would pop up, right? Just because they're servicing hundreds of clients from different domains and verticals. So outside of the technical knowledge, there's also some critical thinking there that is just naturally developed based on the vast number of different situations that they get to see day in and day out.
That's a fantastic point, right? Because, again, they're hitting those edge case scenarios, and particularly senior engineers that get called into those. Heck, Hunter runs a SOC, right? One of for a lot of our outsourced clients, and one of the things that I get dragged into on the regular, right, are the weird situations, right? Nobody calls me for a regular ticket. It's how do we handle this weird one-off situation? And I feel like as a result of that, because, we've got dozens of clients, right? I'm getting a chance to see dozens of weird situations where an in-house engineer just doesn't. That's such a fantastic point there, because that, again, all those lessons get applied to all the other clients too, right? As we go. So closing thoughts. Look, SOC operations cover just much more diverse array of technologies than ever before. This problem is increasing, not decreasing. Specialization is just a demand. It's a demand at this point. And so just be real about that, and real about your ability to do that. And then finally, automation, right? Look, it can solve problems, but process is king when it comes to automation. You have to have the process first. And with that, John, I know you got a couple of slides to cover here. I want to pitch it over to you, my friend. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. So I know we've talked about this a lot, so more of this is just going to be driving the point home. So, every day your SOC team is going to continue to be bombarded with thousands, potentially even millions of security alerts, right? Many are those false positives, harmless events mistaken to be threats. And that just is continuing to create alert fatigue. But as we've talked about, the breadth of knowledge needed to effectively work through all of that, it's just becoming more and more of a problem, right? Nothing new to us, but we do need to continue to be cognizant of that. Automation is going to be critical for efficiency there. But as we talked about, implementing it effectively, it takes time and expertise, right? Many SOCs lack dedicated automation layers, which just continue to leave our analysts bogged down with repetitive tasks that could be automated. And then even when they are automated, it still does require that careful planning and configuration and measurement, as we've talked, right? A lot of process needs to go into that. If you don't do that correctly, you risk auto-closing legitimate threats, to Jake's earlier point, where a lot of these breaches can be mapped to a normal or something that was closed with the wrong disposition. And really, this is just continuing to point to stress, right? Being a SOC analyst, it is a demanding job. The constant pressure to respond to the alerts, investigate potential threats, and those decisions that you're making, they're all critical and they lead to burnout, and in some cases can negatively impact work-life balance. So every wrong decision carries significant consequence, which potentially impacts the entire organization's security posture. So continue to take all of that into consideration and measure, are you being given the resources to effectively tackle this yourself, or do you need to potentially leverage a service provider, as we talked earlier, to help take some of that weight off your shoulders? We talked about this a lot as well, right? People, process, technology, really focusing on investing in your team through training, development, and support, empowering your analysts to be better equipped to handle complex threats and make those informed decisions, and really focus on streamlining workflows, implementing clear incident response procedures, and leveraging threat intel can really help improve that efficiency and accuracy. And then continuing to use advanced tools, SIM, EDR solutions, SOAR platforms, and then focus on automating what is going to have the biggest impact to your organization. This is kind of a peek under the hood of what we feel at Optiv is required to build a truly effective SOC. And you need to really take a look at the left here. We talked about all of this. It has to start with governance, control, strategy. We need to be focused on not only what we're doing today, but how can we also plan for the future? It's no longer as easy as just feeding logs into a SIM and enabling some alerts and everything's done. There's many more layers that need to be considered. We need to really continue to look at the bigger picture of how to pull all of this together. And again, that all starts with governance and strategy. Create that plan, that vision prior to start building and buying more tools. That's just going to cause technology debt later down the line. Really focus around just the SIM that you're choosing today. Are you also making the right decisions so that if there is another business need in the future, if you have a longer term data compliance requirement, can you do that with some of these proprietary SIM collectors, or do you need to invest in that kind of routing and enrich and sending data to multiple endpoint layers? Will that make tomorrow a little bit easier for you as well? So there's a lot that goes into this. Building a robust and adaptable SOC, it's a complex undertaking. And if you're just getting started, it's a great point to evaluate service providers who've been through this before, who have learned those lessons and have much larger pools of resources. If you're determined to do it yourself and you have the budget, it all starts with focusing on that people, process, and technology, and a well-defined data strategy. That's all really the key and critical points here to drive a SOC forward and adapt.
Hey, before we get into questions here, John, can we pivot back to that last slide, because I'd love to drive a point home that you made. You mentioned if you're just getting started on this and then not bringing in a service provider or whatever, focus on the left. I want to note here that the road is littered with bodies, right? Of folks that have gone at this alone, who are building or modernizing a security ops center. I don't mean to imply that you absolutely need to bring in consultants or you need to bring in folks that have been there, done that, got the T-shirt. But I will mention that I do a lot of consulting where I'm there to pick up the pieces, right? When it all didn't go right, and stuff like that John's mentioning here, like getting log routing and ETL, ultimately set up correctly, is stuff that is. These are well-worn lessons by those of us that have been there and done that. And they're things that a lot of folks don't think about that cost infinitely more to go back and re-architect than they do to do it right in the first place, right? And so, I will also share with you that the number of folks that, that I ever talked to that have brought somebody like John in to help, with this process, that regret it are in single-digit percentages, right? Where they're like, didn't get anything of value out of there. It's constantly, stopping somebody from stepping on that proverbial landmine. And again, the costs of getting this wrong are huge compared to the cost of doing it right in the first place. And so that's where I'll just kind of drive that point home there. The road is littered with bodies. Do not go at this alone. If you've never done this before, this is not something you read about and somehow do successfully. You want those lessons learned, being brought there so that you don't stumble over these, what are very predictable to the folks that have done it, stumbling blocks, right? So John, can't hand it back to you there, but I wanted to get that in before we got into questions.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that wraps it up. So I think we can get into the questions phase.
All right. John and Jake, thank you so very much for that. We've got some questions to get to. Everybody in our audience, please take advantage of this opportunity to get your questions answered by John and Jake. Before we get into Q&A, I just want to direct everybody's attention to the webinar survey. If you could fill that out, we would appreciate it. So without further ado, let's get to Rick's question. Rick wants to know, are there best practices for reducing false positives from developer machines who are constantly downloading new files, but low risk? But he doesn't want to leave the system unmonitored. John, do you want to kick us off and then we'll get Jake in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that we actually accomplish based on integrations from an identity perspective and getting a better understanding of kind of a user's job profile. We commonly see developers and even just normal IT admins just running scripts to execute normal business activity, right? They are getting paid to do so, but it can trip EDR. It can trip other tools there as well. So as part of that was one of the problems that we had definitely identified early on, given threat intelligence doesn't tell you a whole lot about that, right? In many cases, the hashes and any of the atomic observables, they're going to come back as unknown because this is one-off. So in those cases where we do see more of this high frequency, lower risk, it looks like it is a normal business strategy, we don't want to do mass exclusions and completely turn off monitoring on those endpoints, but we'll try to get the scalpel out there a little bit more. And are there certain paths that they are allowed to develop from that we can maybe treat a little bit differently in the overall playbook? Sandboxing comes into play there as well, where running those through and kind of getting a score on, do we actually believe this to be malicious or not? And then as well as a lot of those kind of second citing searches, where are there any unusual connection attempts post some of these applications being downloaded or run? Are we seeing any other alerts triggering similar that might be a sign of lateral movement or them trying to get a foothold? And if we don't see that, then that's potentially something that can be closed. But it comes back to really getting all of those data points there so that somebody looks at it and they can have a good understanding of, this looks to be normal for this user's previous baseline activity. We don't see any other indicators of something being malicious, and we can quickly clear that out instead of spending 20 to 30 minutes on each of those, which we wouldn't be able to do just given the scale. Jake?
Yeah, no, I love that. That is definitely one approach, and it's one that we take in a lot of organizations. Another approach that we've taken in some organizations is to really start pushing towards dedicated developer environments. And basically having the developers, your daily driver is, your daily driver is a development workstation. But you're logging in with, just like we have admins who have an admin account, you have a developer account. And that's what you develop against. And then your email and stuff, you're RDPing into a, or joining into a remote desktop or virtual desktop, for email and back office functions, which again, we find most developers are spending like very limited portions of their day in. And so that's an approach. And what that allows us to do then with that dedicated development environment is to be a little bit more, and again, segmented, right? A little bit more lax on the controls there, where we say, hey, we understand pace of development. You're going to be running some stuff, of course, obviously, right? Evaluating. We're not just letting this be Wild West, right? We're evaluating, does particular traffic look malicious, or does a particular tool look malicious? And we're increasing the pace of threat hunts in those environments because we know that our day-to-day endpoint security controls are a little bit looser. That's worked really well in some very high-paced development environments, particularly some financial services that I work with. But of course, now we have that additional architecture component, right? There's no free lunch here, right? So.
Good advice from both of you. I'm interested in circling back. Dark Reading just published a story that just talked about sort of the collateral damage inside the SOC of these sort of drowning in these false alarms and trying to get these alerts under control. I'm wondering if both of you can talk about sort of getting this tooling right as a mechanism for reducing burnout, but also what that looks like from a SOC analyst and operator position. What does the steps, we talked about that 8-month window before SOAR is really up and running and proving value, but what does that transition look like for the rank and file inside the SOC? John?
Yeah, there's a lot of information gathering up front to really make sure that you understand the problem. When you can actually quantify it and sit down that this is going to be the thing that has the biggest impact for our organization, and going around to the team and interviewing, how long is it taking you to do this, right? What is the common thing? And what is, if you were to give me 2 things to improve in your life, what would it be? And then taking all of that back and getting that larger picture from the SOC and then looking at those quantified measurements, you can then kind of visually articulate to them that in the next 3 months, this is what it's going to be like. And you're no longer going to be focusing on these things that you just told me are a time sink to do and you don't enjoy them doing. And instead, you're going to be able to focus on these things. So really, you have to take a very measured approach. And I think you also need to involve all of the people to get their understanding and their voice so that you can show them what this could be like once we actually invest this time and hook all of these things up and build these automated playbooks so that their job ultimately gets better and their quality of life then improves as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, I'm with you. It's data gathering, right? One of the big things that I find, Becky, to your point around false positives is that, we are dealing with false positives because we have, in many cases, we have something that we know we have to detect, but we don't have the appropriate exclusionary information, either indexed correctly or maybe it's some enrichment, what have you. And I can't tell you the number of security ops centers that I've helped by simply modifying that ETL process, that extract, transform, load process, right? We're enriching data as we're ingesting it, right? Not as part of a post-alarm enrichment. And sometimes that is usable, or sometimes many times that's usable in simply, basically by increasing the amount of data that we're ingesting or modifying how we're generating some of our alarms. Sometimes it's just simple detection engineering. Often, again, the data to do the detection engineering just isn't there. I find that to be a very useful approach there. And by the way, too, that all leads itself down the automation path, right? Because the more reliable our detections are, the more likely we are to go automate against them with those response actions. So, what John said, though, and I think what I'm saying here is all tied together, right? And it's information gathering first, right? It's where are we experiencing those biggest problems, and where can we save the biggest amounts of time, by making some in many cases very simple changes.
Wonderful. I want to thank both of you, Jake and John, so much for your expertise today. It was informative, and I know that our audience got a ton out of this as well. If we weren't able to get to your questions today, not to worry. We will supply those to our experts offline, and they will be able to respond to you. We want to thank our sponsor, Optiv, very much, as well as everyone in our audience. We very much appreciate your time and your attention. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. You can feel free to share that with your colleagues who might not have been available to attend our live event. This webinar is copyright 2024 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Optiv, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guest Optiv, I'm Becky Bracken. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. We'll see you at a future Dark Reading event. Bye-bye.